Hey there. My name's Larry Goldberg. I'm Director of Accessible Media at Yahoo. And we have an incredible panel of people, the most powerful organizations in the tech sector, to talk about this project called Teach Access. We look like an ultimate volleyball team, but we do have t-shirts available for the best questions that get asked at the end of our session, so it's going to be really great. I'm going to have everyone go down and introduce themselves, but first I'm going to tell you what Teach Access is, and it's really simple. We define diversity as including people with disabilities, and each of our tech companies are very, very dedicated to making our technologies accessible. We need all of our new hires, and I mean all, to have the basic fundamentals about accessible development and design when they arrive at our door. And we've decided the only way to do that is to get every college in this country to teach technology accessibility to every one of their students. That's our moonshot, and we're doing it. So here's my gang. We're going to start with Jeff at the end and work our way down.
Sure. Hey everybody, my name is Jeff Wieland. I'm the head of accessibility at Facebook. So the goal of that team is really to make it possible for our product teams to build experiences that are usable and robust for people with disabilities. And we also invest in things at the intersection of innovation and new technologies and accessibility. So one example of that from the past year was that we used our object recognition service to describe photos to people who are blind or who have visual impairments, so they can better understand the photos that are being shared with them from their friends and families.
Hi everyone, my name is Laura Palmaro. I am the program manager for accessibility on the Chrome and Chrome OS teams at Google. It's awesome to be here today, so thanks so much for coming to our panel. On the Chrome and Chrome OS teams at Google, basically what we do is we try to make Chrome and all of the Chrome family of products accessible and usable to all of our users. So our team develops a variety of different assistive technology that's built into some of our devices, like Chromebooks, for example. So we develop a screen reader, we develop Braille support, magnification, virtual keyboard access, and a wide variety of other tools to make sure that these devices are usable. And then as my role, I also work with all the other designers and product managers and all the other roles in making all of the general features built within Chrome more and more accessible and usable. So.
Hi everybody, my name is Mike Shebanek. I lead the accessibility team at Yahoo. Larry's on the team there. And our team's responsible for everything Yahoo does, builds, or offers worldwide. So whether it's mobile apps or websites or any other service that you might encounter through Yahoo, the accessibility or the access to that, the compatibility with assistive technology like screen readers and magnifiers and alternate input devices, those things all come through my team to make sure that we can ensure that so every user is welcome no matter what it is we build or offer.
Hi, I'm Amy Chen, and I'm a product manager for accessibility at Adobe, and I work on the Marketing Cloud product line, which is the enterprise software web content management area at Adobe. There are other product managers that work on accessibility in the other cloud areas at Adobe. Adobe has three main clouds, which are Creative Cloud, which is like Photoshop, InDesign, Document Cloud, like your Acrobat and Adobe Sign, and Marketing Cloud, which is the area I work on for enterprise software.
And my name is Ted Drake, and I manage accessibility at Intuit. We make products like TurboTax and QuickBooks. So we create the software that runs most small businesses and the software that most people use to do their own taxes. So for me, it's really important that we make it accessible because we're providing the tools for people with disabilities to own their own businesses, to manage their businesses, and to get real well-paying jobs in different industries and to do their own taxes. So it's all about independence. Before Intuit, I also helped found the Yahoo Accessibility Lab.
One of our most distinguished alums. So before we jump into our questions, let's just find quickly for us who's in the audience. How many of you are part of startups? Looks to be about half. Some students? Students and startups, about 10 people. We're hiring you. And anyone from HR recruiting at companies? We'd love to have you here too. That's a good third or more of the crowd. That's great, and I'm sure some of you are other areas like good PR people. I'm going to ask Laura first from Google. Why should a company care about accessibility? What's the deal?
All right, so big question. So every company should have some way of integrating and accessibility and caring about accessibility, and we have a number of different reasons of why we feel this way, and we're all very aligned on why. First reason just being that this is the right thing to do. So we're all at a conference right now talking about diversity and inclusion, and building accessibly for all users in mind is definitely part of inclusion, absolutely. And when we're thinking about accessibility, it's relevant to a huge population of people. So 15% of the global population has some form of a disability. That's over 1 billion people, which is massive. And 1 in 5 Americans will have some form of a disability over their lifetime. So these are really huge numbers. But as we think about disability, it really impacts us each on a very personal level. And I'll be very happy to share with you guys just a little bit about my personal story. I happen to be what's considered low vision. So I have a very rare visual condition that impacts my central vision. So if you can imagine, anything in the periphery is still clear, so I can navigate and walk around without much assistance, but anything I look directly at, like the crowd, for example, is a mixture of kind of flashing lights and distortion and blur. So this all developed very, very rapidly when I was 14. Within about a week right before I started high school, I lost all of my central vision at that point and went from having 20/20 vision to basically not being able to read anything or see a blackboard or see faces anymore. So this was a very, very rapid transition for me. And to be totally honest, those first few years, I was heavily reliant on other people. And it really came down to kind of working with my parents and my brother on actually reading things aloud when the materials weren't accessible in like an audio format, for example. So over those years, I worked really hard and got a lot of support to be able to find the right mix of assistive technology. So a mix of text-to-speech software and magnification, contrast adjustments, a whole bunch of different things that I could customize to then be able to regain my independence and access what I needed to get through college and get into the workforce. And it was at that point when I actually figured out this right mix that I realized the tremendous impact that technology has on each of our lives. And that's kind of where my passion for the subject of accessibility has come, and just kind of been fueling my career ever since. So when we think about why we all need to be caring about accessibility, we think about these different personas. So I just mentioned low vision, and that can mean a lot of different things to different people. We also need to definitely consider any individuals who are blind and are using a screen reader or perhaps Braille. We need to think about our users who are hard of hearing or deaf, who may be relying on closed captioning or live captions at events like this, or sign language. We need to absolutely consider users who are motor or dexterity challenged and perhaps need to use only the keyboard to navigate on a computer, or if that's not possible, maybe using something like a switch device or head tracking or eye tracking or voice input even. And then we also need to absolutely consider our millions of users who are neurologically diverse. So maybe having a condition like dyslexia, perhaps on the autism spectrum, or have ADHD, and maybe need a little additional assistance kind of focusing on a web page, just as one example, or perhaps just prefer to basically listen to text spoken aloud versus visually reading it. So there's all these different personas. And then we think about the aging population as well. So as our life expectancy has gone up, which is a great thing, we all know that as we get older, we may experience slight deterioration of vision or hearing, and we all expect that our devices are just going to kind of seamlessly transition with us and be able to support us. We also think about things like temporary impairments, like a broken arm, or a situational impairment, like if you're driving and you need to text someone and you can't actually use your hands, so you then have to use voice to input that text in the text message. So we think about that 15%, and then we think about how it just grows exponentially and it expands, and we all feel very strongly that accessibility just will impact all of us at some point in our lives, and accessible design is simply just better design. So we all need to absolutely care about. I know I'm taking up way too much time. So the last thing to quickly mention is for
Hey,
all
you're
of
Google. It's okay.
For all of you in the audience who are working in startups and in the recruiting side, we also, of course, need to think about accessibility internally from an employment perspective. And as we're developing our internal processes and our internal tools and systems, I mean, you need to think about how would somebody who's joining your company be able to access all of that? Would they be able to just be successful in the work environment? Because you want to be able to hire the best candidates possible, regardless of what disability they may or may not have. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Laura. So Teach Access has a website, teachaccess.org. We have T-shirts and we have stickers. Jeff, what else do we do?
Yeah, so the aim of Teach Access, the initiative that we're all a part of up here, is really to try to embed accessibility into our education process. And the reason why we think that that's the place to integrate, at least for me, really starts with an experience that I had at Facebook. So 5 years ago, when I started the accessibility team at Facebook, the central challenge that I faced was, how do we embed accessibility into our life cycle of shipping products? How do we set up the company for success on accessibility? And obviously, one of the key integration points for that is our engineering groups and our product groups, right? So as we started to engage those product teams on things that we thought we could do better for accessibility, we started to experience this common pattern, which was we would engage them and inevitably get a response which was, what is accessibility? What does it mean to make my product usable by somebody who has a disability? And that ultimately was the challenge that we had to tackle. And it was that moment, I think, and sort of being in that experience a few times, that I thought that maybe this was not a problem specific to Facebook. So I started to ask around a bit to some of my peers working in the accessibility space to get a sense for if there really was this void in understanding about accessibility and best practices for accessible design. And it turns out that absolutely, the answer is yes, that all of our individual companies were essentially building training and education programs in our own organizations to prepare our companies for success on this. And it felt like what we really wanted to do was to make it possible for all technologies to be accessible, not just the ones built by Facebook or Google or Yahoo, Adobe, and Intuit, but we want to try to solve this problem at the source. And so I think Mike Shebanek at Yahoo was probably the first person who I spoke to who said, maybe we should do something about this. Like, let's put this into some action. And we first started thinking a little bit locally. So, I did a talk at Stanford to a seminar, HCI seminar class, and that was a good experience. But it felt like we weren't really going to have the effective change that we wanted. So we took a step back, and about 2 years ago, Larry and I met at CSUN, which is the largest technology and disability conference in the world. Strongly recommend checking it out if you've never been. It's in lovely San Diego every year in March. And we just decided that it seemed like now was the time to pool the resources of our companies to tackle this problem at the source, which was education. We really wanted to try to make it possible for students of design and computer science to graduate with an understanding of what accessibility is. I think it's really difficult to build accessible technologies if you can't define what accessibility is and don't know the best practices for building and implementing accessible products. So that's really what we've been up to, and we've been thinking about how to grow that and to find the right integration points for affecting change at a curriculum level, which, as you might expect, is a pretty big challenge. But that's really the genesis, sort of this shared challenge of building education programs at our own companies, but really wanting to prepare the world to build accessible technologies, not just our companies.
Exactly. So we're a startup. We're a social venture startup with zero capital funding, a burn rate of 0, and we're doing great. So Amy, when everyone thinks about design, they think about Adobe. So can you briefly tell us what does accessible design mean at Adobe?
Sure. My name is Amy, and my background is actually in user experience. And even though I've been working in accessibility for the past 10, 12 years, I have an HCI degree from the University of Michigan. And when I think of design, accessibility is about making your products usable by people, including people with disabilities. And that relates to universal design in that you're making products and services available to all users to the greatest extent possible. And what is more reassuring to me is, if you practice good design and you think about other aspects of different users with different disabilities, hopefully you are creating personas that include maybe someone who has low vision or someone who may be using a screen reader, and that you're already doing that as part of your design programs. But as we're, at least in my teams, when I'm talking to my teams, there are certain things I'm encouraging them to do on a practical level as well. In terms of accessibility, the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium, has some guidelines out there called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and they have some basic principles. They have an acronym called POUR, like P-O-U-R, for making your content and your websites perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And on the W3C, w3.org, is that right? W3C.org, sorry. There's a lot more detailed information on each of those specific aspects. But in a general sense, it's just a good idea to keep good design in mind, and for different disabilities. On the design side, sometimes even us in industry, sometimes for the different categories of disabilities, sometimes we're like, I don't know what to do, especially in the area of cognitive disabilities, which is sort of new. It's been it's been an issue for a number of years. It's just that we as industry might not have figured out ways to tackle the problem. And a couple weeks ago, I was in Denver at the Coleman Institute conference on cognitive disabilities. Yeah, and I came away actually very hopeful because a lot of times we think cognitive disabilities, if you're designing for someone who might have autism versus someone who might have dyslexia, like how do you design for so many different users? And there was one presentation there where a guy who's a user researcher actually talked to a lot of kids with autism. And in industry, we're thinking like, oh, how do you make things easy to use, or especially for cognitive disabilities? When I work in enterprise software, it's complex software. And what he found is in talking to these kids with autism, it wasn't the amount of content. There are some of the kids who were really passionate about like finding out a whole lot of information about cars, or one girl really liked looking up on Wikipedia all the information about the different X-Men characters. And then the researcher said the X-Men page on Wikipedia is probably one of the most dense pages that exists in Wikipedia. And the kids with autism really wanted the information. So in a design sense, for us in industry, it's not about like, oh, make the page very clean and sparse. It's about getting users the right information at the right time. So of course there's all these, there's a lot more information you can read about accessibility and designing for accessibility, but also in a general sense, if we keep good design in mind and design for your users and getting them the right information at the right time, as well as tactical accessibility, things like keyboard accessibility, good headings, good content structures, all the best practices, then hopefully we do a pretty good job for all our users.
That's great. And Ted is someone who's actually done that hands-on at a number of companies with some pretty complicated software and authoring tools. So a little bit about front-end best practices and web accessibility.
Before I start, are there any designers in this room? You should take the time to follow Amy, because a lot of times with accessibility, what you're going to see for design is engineers telling you how design should work. So it's really great to have a resource as someone that understands accessibility from the design aspect and not interpreting through an engineer's. I come from a fine art background. I taught myself engineering, so I've seen how engineers think when it comes to design, and sometimes it's pretty bizarre. So yeah, I would highly recommend, if you have a chance, following Amy. And also the Coleman Institute. That went to that presentation about 5 years ago on cognitive. It is mind-blowing. But aside from that, we were talking about education. Now, I actually taught photography for 7 years at a college, so I know what it's like when you're teaching a technology and that technology changes mid-course, i.e. getting rid of film. It's similar with what we're dealing with accessibility. You may have a class that teaches HTML, and in that HTML class, there may be one session where the instructor talks about what is a button, what is a form label, let's talk about these elements and how they're helpful for accessibility. But then you go on and you start looking at platforms. You start looking at Angular and jQuery and Bootstrap and React and all of these other flavors of the month. You get a job and you're not really touching HTML. You're learning how to configure these platforms. You're doing all of these tools, but you're not actually writing HTML. So that one little class that you took in college that talked about HTML may not be resonating with you. So one of the things that we do typically when we're talking with our engineers, we're not focusing so much on HTML. We do talk about HTML because that is the core of accessibility, but we're talking about what really means accessibility. Accessibility is being able to understand, you mentioned poor, but it's what's the role of this object? Is it a button? What's the state? Is it disabled? What is the value? If it's a form input, does it already have a value associated? And more importantly, what's the label? If every object on that page has a role, state, value, and label, it's accessible for the most part. It's also easy to do automated testing on it, and it's easy to localize and everything else. So these are some of the core things we look at. How does keyboards work? What is a keyboard accessibility? How do you design for keyboards? How do you test without a mouse? Focus management. When something changes on the page, how are you managing focus? Now these things go beyond HTML. It's the same concepts when you're doing iOS, Android, .NET. And that's where a lot of times what we spend our time on is first as managers of accessibility in a company, we're making sure the platforms we use are accessible. So when we create common platforms, we spend a lot of time on that. But when it comes to teaching our new hires, we're teaching the core concepts of accessibility, keyboard focus, focus management, labeling, how to use ARIA, how to make sure that if there's an object on the page, people know what it is, how it works, and what it means. And I think that that's something that our universities can teach, not just one day, but throughout all of their, you take an iOS, what does it mean in iOS? You take Android, what does it mean in Android, et cetera.
Great. So we've got some big companies here, and it's an interesting point that all of us have integrated accessibility into our practices. So I want to ask Mike at Yahoo, why do I have a job, and how did we get accessibility working at Yahoo?
There you go. And we are always looking, all of us are always looking for great talent, so talk to us afterwards if this is a field you're interested in. Let me just talk a little bit about setting up a program and what it's like to integrate accessibility into your company or into your startup. One of the probably the big misnomers is that there's an army of people at these big companies, and so you just overwhelm it with people. There's only 4 people in all of Yahoo that manages accessibility worldwide. For every website, for every mobile app, for every internal service, for everything. So it's a really small group, and we're a service organization. We don't actually do the work. We help the other teams do the work. So our success is built on how do we create a change in culture? How do we get the teams that develop this stuff to want to and to learn how to and to care about doing the right thing the right way? So the first thing we did in terms of setting up our program was making sure there was an expectation. I'm sure you may have heard this, we've all heard this, but when we talk to an engineer the first time, the answer the first time is usually, I didn't know I had to do that. I thought I did that last month. Do I have to do it again? That sense of expectation, and that's both from a legal perspective, but for us, it's more about our company's values. Our users expect us to make this stuff work for them, whatever assistive technology they use. So we always bring it back to the user ultimately, and that drives the second thing that we did. First one was set the expectation, so that everybody understands this is an expectation for you when you come to this company. That turned into a really interesting moment because we actually found a way to become part of the onboarding program for our company. So every person that comes to Yahoo comes to our, what we call the accessibility lab, or gets a presentation, and the first thing they hear on the first hour of the first day of the first week is accessibility is important because our users are important, and you don't know what those capabilities are in the user you want to have. So that's the expectation setting. From that, we also make sure that we're focused on the user. So we are actually organized as part of the user research team. So whenever we do user studies, we make sure we have someone with disability somewhere in that process, and usually more than one and with a different disability. We also host these really cool things called user nights, which are kind of unique and kind of fun, but we invite tens or hundreds in some cases of individuals to volunteer to come, and we pair them one-to-one with an engineer for a couple of hours. And we let the engineer just watch how they use this product. And we absolutely make sure we're recruiting and getting people with disabilities to be represented as part of that. And without fail, every engineer who comes back from that night says, I was so nervous about what I was going to do that was so worth my time, and oh my gosh, would I do that again? And I'm going to tell my friend they got to do that. Make sure you get someone with disability because the experience is so interesting, and you learn so much. So there's a lot of rewards waiting for you if you focus on accessibility as part of your program. You're never too small to start. The other lesson we learned is don't wait to the finish. If you're an engineer or a product person, you know that if you wait to the end and say, now I'm going to make my product secure, you're doomed. If you wait to the end and say, now I'm going to localize it in 5 languages, and you didn't leave enough space on the screen, you're doomed. And accessibility is one of those things where you just have to be thinking about it as you go along. And it's really lightweight, and it works really well at the end. So as I mentioned, we have this thing called the Accessibility Lab, which is a place that we've created that allows engineers, developers, anyone, even guests, to come in and actually experience how not being able to do something, but being able to do something with a screen reader and not using your eyes. Being able to successfully play fantasy sports without using your hands. Right? Actually understanding what success looks like so that they understand what they're aiming for. And we bring in, as I said, every new hire, and so that was probably the biggest lesson was we ask every single person, did you hear the word accessibility in your undergraduate work? And almost inevitably the answer is no. And that got us to thinking, wow, there should be at least some basic understanding of these things if you graduate and you want to come into this field, because it's a requirement. And in our company, and in many of these companies are represented, all of them in fact, it's expected. So that's what got us thinking about Teach Access. We realized that this ought to just be something that's just part of the expectation of a graduate. If you're going to come to the workforce and be prepared and you want to land that job, this is a way to stand out. So our recruiters are looking for people with accessibility on their resume, and we as a collection have gone out of our way to add a bullet point, not to an individual job rec, but to the template. So for designers and product managers and for engineers, there's a bullet in the template by default that says if you have any experience at all with accessibility, we're pulling you out first. So it's a really cool opportunity to sort of stand out from the crowd, and we need that because it's still, unfortunately, too rare.
So let's spend the last few minutes talking about what Teach Access has done and where we're going. The job recs, look at teachaccess.org, you'll see these job requisitions that actually say knowledge of accessibility required or preferred. Then we had this amazing Kickstart Workshop last spring. Laura, a little bit, do you remember about that?
Yeah, I do. So yeah, we had a 2-day Kickstart Workshop where it was over 40 of us actually that came together. So all of us, all the companies represented here, as well as a number of other tech companies like LinkedIn and HP, a number of others as well. Then we had representatives from some advocacy organizations like the American Council for the Blind. And then we had a large number of people from academia. So people from Stanford, NYU, Georgia Tech, MIT, CSUN, a whole bunch, Michigan, a whole bunch of different universities. And we all came together and we kind of shared just about what's been going on the tech side and on the academia side of what sort of challenges that we're facing in terms of actually scaling and integrating accessibility in at the company level or into the curricula. And the most powerful thing that I walked away from that was just that it was so amazing to all be in the same room together and just talk about this all together, and realizing that, kind of going back to what Jeff was saying, this is a collective that we are now a part of, and we're able to make a lot more change together versus individually doing this just at each individual institution. So anyone else want to comment on it? Or?
It was great. And after that, we launched an online tutorial. And Facebook was the one who designed it, and you can actually practice your skills.
Yeah, so the long-term aim is definitely to make accessibility a part of degree programs for computer science and design and user research, with a focus in the United States right now. But certainly changing curricula takes a long time. And not everyone who goes off and works in technology goes through those degree programs, sort of as Ted was mentioning earlier. So one idea that we had was to create a free and accessible online tutorial that talks through some of the practitioner best practices for accessibility. Some things that talk through the concepts that Ted mentioned before and Amy mentioned about design. Some things that you should be keeping in mind as you are building web experiences and mobile applications. So that's freely available. You can check it out at teachaccess.org. It's also on GitHub. It's an open source project, so if you want to contribute to it, make it better, or fork it and modify it for your own purposes, by all means, please do that. But I think that's one of the ways that we felt like we could move a little bit quicker in terms of offering a repository that talked through some of the best practices that we sort of collated and pulled together from the various training programs that we have implemented in our own companies.
Let me just add too, I think, just to be super clear, there are some amazing programs that exist today to create accessibility experts, but there will never be enough experts. And the experts aren't the ones that are actually building the products. They're the ones that are doing the research, pushing the frontiers, maybe teaching. It's actually the rank and file that actually gets the hard work done, as it turns out. And so it's really about, Teach Access is about making the rank and file, the average graduate who's not going to be an expert in accessibility, that's not their career path, to at least have a working knowledge of the different types of barriers that exist, the different types of assistive technology products people use, and sort of what the issues are, so that they're prepared to have that conversation, so that they're prepared to respond, whether they're in PR or whether they're in recruiting or whether they're just a manager. When that issue comes up, they're prepared to go, I understand why that's important, and I know how to prioritize it. And I understand why a user might want that and how we need to communicate it. So Teach Access is really about raising the tide, if you will, the basic general understanding in the general graduate population, not necessarily just going after a really great advanced degree program. Those do already exist. And that's why it's an interesting project and why we're so excited about it.
That too? Yeah, I think what Mike said too, if we have more people asking about accessibility in your own companies, again, I think for each of us, the actual people who work full-time on accessibility is really small. And I'm trying to integrate myself into product teams, on the agile product teams and things like that. But I think it's about Teach Access, teaching everybody, including all of you here, as you're working at your companies, asking about things like color contrast or, hey, can I use this with a keyboard? The more we start asking these questions, the more we can increase the level of accessibility on all these products.
Asking questions? Let's do that. Teach Access is working on accreditation, virtual lectures from all of us for universities, a student ambassador program, and we mostly want you guys to take this with you. So write to us at teachaccess@googlegroups.com. Go to our website, teachaccess.org, and ask us questions now. And as I said, the best questions get T-shirts. Not that there's any lack of T-shirts here. So do we have a mic for the audience?
Hello? Test. All right, so I'm back. All right, so we're going to move into the Q&A section. First, before we do, let's get a round of applause for this panel. Awesome discussion. And just so you know, there was printed on the program, the agenda, that there's going to be a break. We're not going to take that break. We're going to go right into Q&A. And as soon as we're done, right at about 4 o'clock, we're going to bring on Chris Gentile from Google and move into the last 2 elements of the day. Okay? So back to you. Questions? I'll work this side of the room, and there's a mic on that side of the room as well.
Sorry. Hi. Thank you for all being here and sharing with us. I'm on a really small development team, probably 2 or 3 people working on the front end. How do you suggest that I can go and kind of communicate the importance and the use case for spending the time to go back and kind of retrofit our website, which is still pretty much in its early stages, with kind of accessibility best practices?
Can you grab that one? I'll take that one. What we can share with you based on probably decades of experience that you might not know if you haven't been down this road before is there are massive benefits waiting for you on the other side. So the trick is communicating some of those. So one of the things we've learned through experience is when we focus on disabled access, our designs tend to get simpler, but not dumbed down, just easier to use. So the usability goes up, but it goes up for everybody. When we create things that have good contrast for people with low vision, everyone goes, I don't know why I like it better, but I like it better. Because they don't know why, but they understand it just is easier to read. When it's cognitively less load, they use it more. That increases usage time. So we can go through a laundry list of those, but what we have found is by focusing in this area, we tend to find problems first. The edge cases are where the action is, and these are usually edge cases for an engineer or designer. And so we find them sooner and fix them faster, and the product gets better for everyone. And that's what we call universal design. And so that is a huge benefit, and it's a really hard thing sometimes to understand, but when you experience it once, you will never forget it, and it changes your thinking. And ultimately, that's the difference. This isn't an activity to do accessibility, like we were saying about, I did that last year, do I have to do it again? It's really about a way of thinking about it and understanding your user better and anticipating those problems and solving them. So try and take advantage of noticing what's changing and explaining that back to the engineers and saying, look, after we did this round with someone with low vision, after we did this round with someone with hearing loss, look how much better other people are responding to that same fix. And it starts to build on itself, and you get better and better faster.
Also, from an Intuit standpoint, we do lean startup, which means that we build our products with a team that's no bigger than 2 pizzas, so it's small. Our product manager, designer, and engineers are usually groups of 7 to 10 people. So we are in that situation where how do you go to this team that's building a new product, but you only have X amount of resources? But what we look at is what is the overall user experience? The first thing you should do is have them take the mouse away. And can they still complete the task without a mouse? That's usually the first test. And that's where people learn. Because one of the things you do when you start focusing on keyboard, things just work. That's one of the things I point to them is like focus management. When you take care of focus management, it just works. And when you don't do it, you throw up all these barriers. It's like the focus goes to the top of the page instead of where it should go. The focus is in the background of the page in this invisible link. You know, when people stop using the mouse and they start using it with the keyboard, they learn a lot. And that's something that doesn't cost any money. Now, when you do that, also what you're setting yourself up for is automated testing. You're helping people with screen readers. You're helping people that use Dragon and they're talking to their computers, and people that can't move, they can only move like an eyeball or something like that. It's also helping them. So it is going back to what you're saying. It's about making a good experience for everybody. And also, if you can bring in someone that's blind to use your product, you are going to learn things that you never knew existed. Because a blind person, when they come to a product for the first time, they tend to want to see what is on the screen. What can I do? And so they do a lot of exploration that a sighted person just doesn't do. And that's one of the things we get to take away from is every time we bring in a blind person to look at a product, the teams are amazed at what they missed.
Oh, can I tag onto that too? Sorry, just 2 seconds. Again, following what Ted was saying about keyboard, very, very important. Just testing with keyboard will help you find a lot of issues. And also, I've been working at enterprise software for 15 years. I'm going to botch this up completely, but there's some articles out there on accessibility, ROI, return on investment. Like, the sooner you can, retrofitting something is always going to be more expensive later on. So if you have accessibility in mind making those decisions, you can incorporate that into the process. Also in the testing part, again, I'm going to botch these numbers because I don't remember them. In user experience, when you're doing usability testing, they say there's a number. You can if you run a test with 7 to 9 people, you're going to find the majority of issues. Same if you bring someone in with a user with a disability, because it might be a usability problem for somebody else, but that same usability problem will become a barrier to them completing the task for accessibility.
So we have time for one more quick question, and I got the first person who put her hand up in the back here. So please keep the answers brief because we have time for one quick question.
I'll keep the question brief too. So I heard you talk a lot about the user experience. Part of the challenge for persons with disabilities is getting employment and having the same access as a person as an employee. What are you doing within your companies to not just work with the end user, but to bring people with disabilities on, not necessarily in a testing role, because not all of us are testers, but to enhance and encourage that expansion and exploration?
Yeah, I can take at least quickly. Yeah, so at Facebook, we have a diversity recruiting team. And there are people who are explicitly focused on trying to find people with disabilities in various places for various roles, not just for QA and testing roles, but across the company. And so we have people who are actively looking to try to find and source people with disabilities to make sure that Facebook is building a diverse company. I think the only way that we can build for a global audience is if our employee base better matches the diversity that's in the world. So on Facebook side, that's very much governed by the diversity programs team. So yeah, I don't work on that team, but that's their focus.
I can add a little bit of insight also from the Google side. A group of us who, each of us have different disabilities ourselves, actually, we've pulled together what we call the Employees Access Working Group. And this essentially has different prongs of our strategy. So one is just making sure that all of our internal processes and all of our internal tools are in fact accessible. So we get a lot of feedback from all the different Googlers who have different disabilities on what's working, what's not working. Then we work with all of our external facing products that we also use internally, like Gmail and Google Hangouts, all those sorts of things, and make sure we also have really constant feedback channels of what's working and how we could actually improve the products. And then third, we have like an actual physical accessibility component where we're thinking about things like our campus and our office buildings and how do we make this actually like go way above and beyond ADA standards and make sure that things are actually intuitive and that any Googler, for just one example, who is blind can understand how to get around very easily and know where things are. And so we have these different strategies and we have different teams working on all of these different items, I guess. Yeah.
Let me just add 2 quick things, very practical. We changed the purchasing agreement. We went to legal and said, you got to ask for accessibility in the purchasing agreement for any service or contract we have. And we asked our vendor one question: how did you test it? And that has worked wonders.
That's great. And we can talk to more of you, let's say on the side of the stage when we're done. We have more T-shirts in case you have good questions. We can meet you over there afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Let's give them a round of applause. Thanks so much.